The great hall lies in ruins, the rushes soaked with blood, and I kneel among the broken shields as the conquerors take their prize. Did you know a single noble woman could be ransomed for the same silver it cost to feed a household for a year? I watched a lady once, her silks torn, her hands bound, sold like a treasure chest emptied of jewels, her name struck from her own people's lineage. This is Viking, life merciless, unflinching, and absolute. Stay with me and witness the truth behind it. The battle was over. Smoke drifted in slow, heavy veils above the hall, its roof beams blackened where the fire had licked but not consumed. Shields lay cracked, swords bent, and among them the survivors stood bound in iron. The noble women, daughters of kings and wives of jarls, felt the cold weight of chains bite into their wrists. They had once moved through these chambers with authority, commanding servants and directing feasts. Now they were cargo. Their cries blended with the groans of the dying, a chorus of defeat that no skald would celebrate. Viking raiders understood the worth of such captives. Gold and silver could be spent, cattle could perish, but noble women carried with them lineage, alliances, and skill. They were as valuable as treasure chests, but living ones, capable of bearing heirs or binding peace through forced marriage. When a hall was taken, warriors searched not only for loot, but for women of rank, for these were the trophies that carried prestige far beyond the battlefield. Their fate was calculated before the flames had cooled. The sagas and chronicles, written in terse lines, speak of these women only as numbers. A great many were taken, they say, as if speaking of livestock. Yet in those numbers were faces, each carrying memories of fathers and brothers who had fallen in their defence. The women stood in silence, forced into lines by their captors, their hair pulled, their clothing torn, their names already fading from the record. Each one knew that the chains on her arms were not temporary. They marked the beginning of another life, one that was chosen for them by conquest. In Norse law, once a noble woman was captured, her status was stripped. The word used was thrall property, not person. No court of law would recognize her voice, no oath would be valid from her tongue. Her former identity, carved by birth and title, vanished the moment she was bound. To her captors, she was neither queen nor abbess, but simply spoil. The transition was brutal and deliberate, a reminder that even lineage could be broken when steel and fire prevailed. As the captives were marched toward the waiting longships, the air was filled with the sound of boots on frozen earth and the hiss of the tide against stone. Some of the women wept openly, others walked stiff with pride, refusing tears, though each step carried them farther from the lands of their birth. For the warriors, this was victory made flesh. Each bound figure represented wealth, leverage, or legacy. A noble woman could ransom a city, seal a fragile alliance, or bear children who would grow into lords of new lands. Behind them, the conquered hall lay silent. The banners of the fallen family hung scorched, their colours smeared with soot. Dogs nosed among the dead, scavenging where glory had burned away. But the true prize was already leaving, chains clinking with every step. It was not just halls or crowns that were taken in conquest. It was bloodlines carried away across the sea. In those lines of captives, the future of kingdoms shifted, silent and unrecorded, except in the iron that bound them. The sea was the next prison. When the captives were herded onto the longships, the air turned heavy with the stench of sweat, salt, and fear. Warriors crowded the deck above, but the noble women were pushed below, into the narrow belly of the vessel where the timbers creaked and the light fell only in thin slits. The longship, once a marvel of freedom to the Norse, became a coffin of silence to those bound within. They sat shoulder to shoulder, shackled in rows, their fine garments already stained with dirt and brine, their breath mingling in the darkness. The voyage was a trial designed to strip away whatever remained of their old lives. Food was scarce, water scarcer still, and sickness spread quickly in the cramped quarters. For every 10 captives taken aboard, perhaps only 7 would reach the market shores alive. The weak perished quietly, their bodies thrown overboard with no words spoken, their names swallowed by the sea. Even queens became faceless when the waves decided. Survival was the only law in that narrow hull, and survival favoured those who could endure hunger, cold, and despair. Above deck, the warriors laughed and drank, their voices carrying down to the captives like reminders of power. Each gust of wind that snapped the sails was a reminder that the women were being carried farther from their homes with every passing hour. The shoreline of their birth vanished, replaced by the endless horizon. No longer daughters of kingdoms, they were anonymous shadows in the hold, each life reduced to the clang of chains and the rise and fall of the tide. Some women tried to hold to memory. They whispered prayers in Latin, Gaelic, or Saxon, clutching a hidden bead or torn scrap of cloth as if it might carry them home. Others withdrew into silence, their eyes hollow, their spirits already far away. A few whispered songs to calm children taken with them, lullabies spoken in trembling tones that blended with the groan of the hull. Every voice was fragile, nearly drowned by the sea's roar. The longship was a crucible. Those who endured the crossing arrived hardened, stripped of illusions, prepared for the next stage of captivity. They had survived the selection of war, and now the judgment of the ocean. When the ships finally reached port, whether Dublin, Hedeby, or York, the captives who stumbled onto shore were no longer noble women in the eyes of their captors. They were inventory, living silver to be weighed and traded. Yet within the silence of the decks, something else endured: memory. Though sagas would not record their names, though markets would list them as property, the women carried with them stories of kingdoms burned, halls fallen, and crowns broken. These stories did not die in the darkness of the ship. They lingered, whispered from mother to child in strange lands, carried like embers through the generations. The decks of the longships were silent, but silence itself became a vessel, carrying their fate across the sea. When the longships scraped against the timbers of Dublin's quays, the journey ended not in freedom but in display. The city had risen from a Viking stronghold into one of the largest slave markets in Western Europe, its streets lined with stalls, its air thick with the cry of merchants. For noble women, the descent from halls of gold to the platform of sail was swift and final. They were herded ashore with the others, wrists still bound, their faces pale beneath the northern sky. In Dublin, human life was measured in silver. A healthy young woman could fetch the price of a small farmstead, sometimes more if she carried noble bearing or skill. Buyers looked not at her lineage, but at her teeth, her hair, her hips, the strength of her hands. A princess and a farmer's daughter might stand side by side, the distinction blurred by the clang of coin. Some were purchased by Norse settlers, eager to build households. Others were shipped east to Hedeby, Birka, or even further along the rivers into the Byzantine Empire. The market was not a side trade, it was the beating heart of the Viking economy. The noble women felt the weight of eyes upon them. Where once courtiers bowed in their presence, now traders pinched their arms, appraised their weaving calluses, or debated their age aloud. Every gesture was dehumanizing, a deliberate stripping of the past. Names were rarely spoken. Instead, women were reclassified as property, their identities dissolved into the cold language of trade: thrall, bondwoman, concubine. To the market, they were no longer daughters of kings, but units of value. Behind the stalls, silver weighed on scales clinked into pouches, and deals were struck as casually as for hides or timber. Some noble women were bought by warlords to elevate their status, displayed in halls as tokens of wealth and conquest. Others were sold into farms, where their royal birth meant nothing against the endless labour of weaving, cooking, or bearing children for strangers. A few were ransomed back at great cost, their freedom purchased by families desperate to restore lost honour. But many more vanished, absorbed into new households, their former lives remembered only by themselves. The Dublin market thrummed with noise, yet for the captives it was a silence louder than the sea. Each woman understood that a line had been crossed, one from which there was no return. Their crowns had been melted into coins, their thrones reduced to stalls. The city's cobbles carried away the sound of their footsteps, scattering them across the north like seeds thrown into strange soil. And yet, even here, fragments endured. A lullaby hummed in Gaelic, a whispered prayer in Latin, a memory spoken softly to a child. These were the only treasures smuggled past the market's scales. Though sagas would not record their names, though the annals noted only numbers, the Dublin market became the crucible in which their stories were broken, reshaped, and carried into the long shadow of the Viking world. Among all the captives, none drew more attention than the daughters of kings. A princess was not only a woman, but a symbol, her presence a trophy, her body a claim upon the lands her father once ruled. In the markets of Dublin or Hedeby, when such figures appeared, the bidding rose sharply, voices of traders echoing as silver clinked like falling rain. The worth of a princess could be greater than that of a chest of relics, for she carried with her the illusion of legitimacy. To own her was to hold power in flesh. The sagas record such tales in fragments. A king's daughter might vanish from a raid, only to reappear in another land as a concubine or wife, her lineage remembered only when it suited her captor. The Icelandic sagas speak of Melkorka, sold in Norway, who bore a son to a chieftain, yet hid her true name until the boy was grown. Such silence was armor. For a princess, her birth could make her valuable, but it could also make her dangerous. To reveal too much was to invite chains all the tighter. On the day of sale, a princess stood apart. Her silks were gone, replaced by garments of the defeated, yet her bearing betrayed her. The tilt of her chin, the fire in her eyes, the grace in her step, all these told seasoned merchants she was no common captive. Buyers leaned closer, noting how she held herself even in chains. They whispered sums, exchanged glances, gauging how much her presence might elevate their standing in the eyes of rivals. In such moments, her worth was no longer hers to claim. It was measured in the weight of silver, in the breadth of her captor's ambition. Those who purchased princesses rarely sought their labour. Instead, they sought their symbolism. Some became concubines, displayed in the smoky warmth of longhouses, their noble birth proof of a warlord's reach. Others were forced into marriage, alliances forged on the backs of vows spoken under duress. A union with a princess could cement control over conquered lands, presenting conquest as inheritance rather than theft. The woman herself, once cherished as the future of her people, became the seal on another's dominion. And yet, for all this value, the life of a princess was no more secure than that of the lowliest thrall. If she defied her captor, she could be beaten, silenced, or killed. If she bore a child, the boy might be raised as heir, while she faded into the background of sagas written by men. If she whispered her true name, she risked exposing herself to those who might ransom or exploit her further. Every choice carried weight, and every silence was survival. The price of a princess was never only silver. It was dignity, stripped away in the marketplace. It was lineage, fractured and scattered across foreign shores. And it was memory, carried in fragments by children who bore half-forgotten songs of their mothers' homelands. In those fragments, the truth endured that even a princess, promised to inherit kingdoms, could be reduced to a line item in the spoils of war. In the longhouses of the north, silence could be sharper than a blade. Among the captives who found themselves drawn into the households of jarls and chieftains, some chose not to speak at all. Chronicles and sagas tell of noble women who feigned muteness for years, refusing to give captors the satisfaction of hearing their voices. For these women, silence was a shield. A concubine without a name, without a tongue, could not be easily exploited through lineage or oath. She became a shadow at the hearth, present yet unreachable. The tale of Melkorka, daughter of an Irish king, lingers in Icelandic saga. Purchased in a Norwegian market, she was taken to Iceland as the concubine of a chieftain. For years, she spoke no word, allowing all to believe she was mute. In her silence, she carried her own defiance, preserving some piece of herself beyond her captor's reach. When at last her son grew, she whispered to him her true heritage, teaching him Gaelic in secret. Through him, her story re-emerged, a buried ember that refused to die. Silence was not submission. In the world of the Vikings, words were power, oaths bound men, insults sparked feuds, and sagas carved memory into stone. By withholding speech, concubines denied their captors that power. They refused to grant their names to the tongues of strangers, refused to let their stories be rewritten as trophies of conquest. Instead, they clung to secrecy, their pasts locked away like treasures hidden beneath earth. Life within the longhouse was harsh. Concubines served beside wives, weaving, cooking, bearing children whose futures belonged to another lineage. They endured the glances of servants who knew their value in silver, the suspicion of wives who saw them as rivals, the command of masters who viewed them as possessions. Yet within the constant demands, silence became rebellion. A concubine who never spoke reminded all who watched her that she remained unknowable, that her true self lay beyond their grasp. Not all could keep the silence. Some were broken, their voices forced into pleas or submission. Others perished without ever uttering their names again. But the sagas remember those who endured, women who outlasted their chains by retreating inward. For them, silence was both armor and prison, protecting their essence while isolating them from the world they were forced to inhabit. The concubine's silence echoed across generations. Sons born of such unions often carried the secret tongues of their mothers, hidden languages passed down in whispers beside streams or by firelight. These fragments preserved what markets and chains tried to erase. They bore witness to the resilience of women who, though stripped of crown and title, refused to surrender the last piece of themselves. In the smoky halls, where songs of victory were sung and horns clattered with drink, the silent concubine sat apart. She did not join the laughter or the boasting. She endured. And in that endurance, she shaped a legacy, not of words, but of unyielding quiet that outlasted the clamour of conquest. Inside the smoky rafters of the Viking longhouse, power was not only carved with axes, but sealed with women's bodies. When raiding gave way to feasting, when silver and cattle had been counted, the question of alliances arose. Noble women, once guarded as jewels of their fathers' halls, became bargaining chips in these settlements. The longhouse, with its benches of warriors and its high seat of the Jarl, became a court where lives were bartered. A daughter of a slain lord might be offered as concubine to a trusted warrior, her presence a reward for loyalty. Another might be promised in a forced marriage to a rival, binding him by blood instead of oath. These bargains were spoken not in the language of affection, but of strategy. Each woman was currency, her worth measured in how many swords her union could command, or how much land her womb could tie to a lineage. She sat at the edge of the firelight, hearing men debate her future as though she were absent, her silence expected, her consent irrelevant. In Norse law, women could inherit, but captives fell outside that order. Once declared thrall, their voices no longer counted in the thing, the great assembly where law was shaped. Even a noble woman, once accustomed to influencing counsel, could find herself erased with a single proclamation. Her body remained, but her authority vanished. To resist was to risk death or humiliation. To comply was to become a pawn in games larger than herself. The bargain was never hers to strike. Some sagas tell of wives who raged against these intrusions, forced to share their hearths with rivals brought home from foreign halls. Jealousy could ignite feuds within the longhouse, turning mead benches into battlegrounds of whispered insults and sudden violence. For the women caught between, their place was precarious. To gain a fragment of stability, they might learn the tongue of their captors, weave with skill, or bear children quickly, proving their usefulness beyond politics. Survival demanded adaptation, even as the memory of home gnawed at them. These bargains could ripple across generations. A captive wife might birth sons who rose to be jarls themselves, their half-foreign heritage hidden beneath Norse names. In Iceland, genealogies reveal how entire bloodlines sprang from women taken in conquest. The Longhouse bargains, struck in the heat of firelit councils, reshaped the destiny of families and regions alike. What began as captivity became foundation, though for the women it was never chosen. The Longhouse seemed to breathe with these bargains. Smoke curled upward, mingling with the sound of oaths and the clatter of drinking horns. At the centre sat men who wielded power, while at the edges sat the women whose futures were being traded. The firelight illuminated their faces, but cast long shadows, reminders that in this world their fates were decided not by birth or will, but by the bargains struck across the hall. And in those shadows, the quiet weight of their suffering lingered, shaping the very order of Viking society. There are tales in the chronicles that speak of women who chose to scar their own beauty rather than be claimed as spoils. Among the most haunting is the account of Coldingham, a monastery on the windswept cliffs of Northumbria. When word spread that the great heathen army approached, the abbess Ebba the Younger gathered her sisters in the chapter house. They knew what Viking raiders sought, as much as silver or relics, women of status, whose capture brought both wealth and shame. Faced with that fate, Ebba lifted a razor and cut away her own nose and lip, disfiguring herself before the eyes of her community. One by one, the nuns followed, their faces made into masks of blood. The Vikings stormed the monastery soon after, expecting trembling captives. Instead, they found a hall of women who had stripped themselves of what the raiders valued most. Deprived of their prize, the invaders responded with fire. The monastery burned with the sisters still inside, their final defiance swallowed by flame. To the chroniclers, their act was proof of holy resistance. To the Vikings, it was insult repaid in kind. For the women themselves, it was the only choice left between dishonour and death. This story was not an isolated one. Across Britain and Ireland, noble women in cloisters and courts sometimes resorted to similar acts. Some cut their hair short and smeared their faces with ash to appear wretched. Others prayed for death in battle, preferring the sword to the shame of captivity. Their resistance was rarely recorded in detail. Most annals noted only, "many were taken," erasing the small acts of courage that preceded the silence. Yet the echoes remain, glimpses of women who wrested agency from the jaws of conquest by marking their own flesh. For the Vikings, such defiance was infuriating. Their law valued women as property, as wealth in human form. To mutilate oneself was to destroy part of that value. It was rebellion not of arms but of will, a final grasp at control when all else was lost. The sagas, composed later by Norse poets, rarely honoured these women. Instead, they passed in whispers through foreign chronicles, remembered more by those who mourned their loss than by those who caused it. The image of disfigured women standing silent before the clash of steel lingers as a stark reminder of the choices forced upon captives. To live as thrall, concubine, or wife of the conqueror was one road. To die by one's own hand, or to mark the body in refusal, was another. Neither path was born of freedom, but both spoke to the terrible gravity of survival in an age where war consumed not only men, but the women who stood behind them. Thus, in the smoke of burned abbeys and the silence of ruined halls, the story of disfigured defiance endures. It was not victory nor escape, but it was a stand one carved into flesh, one that denied the conqueror full triumph. In their scars, those women left a legacy that fire could not erase. High above the river Clyde, Dumbarton Rock rose like a fortress carved by the gods themselves. Its cliffs were sheer, its walls thick, its well deep. For 4 long months in the year 870, the kingdom of Strathclyde staked its survival on that rock. Inside its defences, nobles and warriors, their wives and daughters, endured the hunger of siege. Outside, the Vikings waited Olaf the White of Dublin and Ivar, son of Ragnar, their fleets drawn up along the riverbank, their campfires burning night after night. The defenders trusted the strength of stone, but stone cannot quench thirst. When the well within the fortress ran dry, the days turned desperate. Noble women carried empty buckets through the halls, listening to children wail for water that no one could give. Their rings and brooches, once glittering with royal pride, seemed useless trinkets against the pangs of thirst. By the 100th day, faces were gaunt, lips cracked, and even kings knew surrender was near. When the gates finally opened, it was not victory, but survival that guided the captives down the path. King Arthgal and his household walked into Viking hands, their banners lowered, their fates bound in chains. The noble women of Strathclyde queens, daughters, wives, were led away with the rest, their lineage erased as swiftly as a torch snuffed in the wind. The annals record it with cruel brevity. The fortress yielded, and a great booty in people was carried away. Behind those words lay the cries of women torn from their homeland, their voices drowned by the river's current. The Vikings spent the winter on the Clyde, gathering their plunder. For the women, there was no reprieve. They were penned, sorted, prepared for transport like livestock. When spring came, 200 ships set sail for Dublin, their decks groaning with treasure and human cargo. The noble women of Strathclyde, who once walked proudly in halls hung with tapestries, now sat bound among thralls. Their identities collapsed into the economy of conquest. Some would be sold in Dublin's markets, their beauty and skill fetching high sums. Others would be carried farther still to Hedeby, to Birka, to the courts of the Rus, where even Byzantine gold could be bought with their bodies. For Arthgal, the king, the end came swiftly in Dublin, slain at the will of Olaf. But for his wife and the noble women beside her, the end stretched longer, a life of servitude that left no trace in the chronicles. Their sons, if any were born, might rise in strange lands as fosterlings of other clans, their mothers' voices silenced. Their daughters might be married into foreign bloodlines, weaving the legacy of Strathclyde into the fabric of their captors' world. The rock itself still stands, scarred but unbroken, a monument to endurance. Yet its greatest treasure was never its walls or its height, it was the people taken from within. In their chains, the true cost of that siege was carried across the sea, a reminder that even the mightiest fortress cannot protect the women who bear the weight of lineage in an age of conquest. In the autumn of the year 1011, the heart of Kent trembled. Canterbury, seat of the English Church, had stood proud behind its walls for 20 days of siege. Priests prayed in the cathedral, soldiers kept vigil on the ramparts, and within the cloisters, noble women clung to hope that the Danes would break away as they had in years before. But betrayal opened the gates. A man named Elfmere, once spared from death by Archbishop Elfhere, guided the enemy inside. In an instant, prayers became screams, and the city's fate was sealed. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes the sack in stark tones. The archbishop seized, the church leaders bound, the city pillaged. Among the captives were women of high station abbesses, reeves' wives, and noble daughters who had sought sanctuary within the holy walls. Unlike the common folk who perished by sword or fire, these women were spared, not from mercy but from calculation. To the Danes, they were too valuable to kill. They would serve instead as bargaining chips, hostages, in a game where kingdoms themselves were at stake. The women were not chained to oars or thrust into markets. Instead, they were kept in guarded camps, their fates bound to negotiations of silver. Day after day, they endured the waiting, hearing their captors speak of them as pieces on a board. This one worth so many ounces, that one worth a town's tribute. To men who bartered kingdoms, a noble woman's freedom could be weighed against coin heaped on a scale. For the captives, each sunrise was a reminder that their survival hung on decisions made by men far away, kings and councils debating the value of their release. For months, Archbishop Elphia languished among them. He refused ransom, declaring that he would not burden his people with the cost of his freedom. His defiance inspired the captives, but sealed his doom. At a drunken feast in Greenwich, the Danes hurled bones at him until, in frustration, one warrior split his skull with an axe. The women witnessed the execution of a holy man, their protector struck down before their eyes. In that moment, they understood the cruel truth. Their lives depended not on faith, but on silver. In the spring of 1012, that silver came. A staggering payment of £48,000 was gathered, a sum so vast it nearly emptied England's coffers. It bought the withdrawal of the army and the release of highborn captives. The women walked free, but their freedom was not victory. They returned to halls reduced to ash, to kin slaughtered, to kingdoms weakened by the cost of their survival. Their bodies were intact, but their honour, their dignity, and their sense of safety were forever broken. The chronicles preserve their story not with names, but with numbers. They are remembered as part of a ransom, their worth reduced to a line of silver tallied in a ledger. Yet, behind that cold record were living women, who endured months of captivity with no weapon but patience, pawns whose lives were spent and bought in the brutal arithmetic of Viking war. When men speak of the settlement of Iceland, they tell of brave explorers steering longships into the fog, of rocky shores and fertile valleys awaiting cultivation. They praise the courage of those who sought freedom beyond the reach of Norwegian kings. Yet, the Book of Settlements, the Landnamabok, preserves another truth. Many of the women who became the mothers of Iceland were captives, torn from Ireland and Scotland, carried across seas against their will. Their noble birth, their cloistered vows, their quiet lives in stone halls, all were shattered the moment a Viking hand closed around their wrist. In those first winters, the new farms clung to survival. The earth was stubborn, the winds merciless. The women who found themselves in these raw landscapes bore the heaviest burden. Among them were noble daughters, taken in raids, who once commanded servants and moved within kingdoms of order. Now they wove cloth until their fingers bled, cooked in smoke-darkened hearths, and bore children into homes that did not know their names. They were called wives, but their consent had never been sought. Their crowns were left behind, replaced by iron pots and rough wool garments. One such tale lingers of a woman named Refgard, daughter of an Irish house, taken by Eyvind de Cirkvir. She became his wife not by choice, but by force, her lineage absorbed into the lineage of settlers. Others like her entered the genealogies as nameless foreign wives, their bloodlines noted, but their voices silenced. Yet, archaeology and modern science reveal their presence. Genetic studies show that while most Icelandic settlers were Norse men, the majority of maternal lines trace back to Ireland and Scotland. The math is merciless. The foundations of Iceland were laid upon women brought as spoils. Within the longhouses of these settlements, tensions smouldered. The noble women, foreign to the land, often brought with them strange tongues and the faith of the cross. They sang lullabies in Gaelic, whispered prayers to saints long forgotten by their captors. Their children grew, straddling two worlds, bearing Norse names, learning sagas at the fire, yet carrying the memory of another homeland through their mothers' stories. These fragments, smuggled through song and speech, were the last remnants of their stolen heritage. For the settlers, these women represented more than wives. They were assets, binding households together with labour and with heirs. In harsh winters, when survival balanced on the edge of famine, A woman's weaving could clothe a family. Her knowledge of healing herbs could save lives. Her womb could secure a lineage. In every way, the noble women taken from across the sea became indispensable to the new society, though they lived in it as outsiders. Thus the tale of Iceland's founding is shadowed by silence. Behind every proud saga of settlement lies an unspoken story of women whose choice was stripped away. They stood on the edge of strange fjords, their eyes scanning horizons they would never cross again. They were settlers not by will, but by conquest, their lives planted in foreign soil, their roots cut from the kingdoms they once called home. In their forced endurance, an entire nation was born. In the summer of 1904, when archaeologists opened the great burial mound at Oseberg in Norway, they uncovered a vessel unlike any other. A longship carved with curling beasts, its timbers preserved in clay, its chamber filled with treasures. Inside lay two women, one aged and frail, likely a queen or priestess, wrapped in authority even in death. The other, younger by decades, was buried beside her. For generations, scholars believed she was a servant, a companion who followed her mistress into the grave. But the bones tell a darker tale. Analysis revealed that the younger woman bore features foreign to Scandinavia. Her DNA traced not to Norway's fjords, but to distant lands near the Black Sea. Her teeth bore marks of a sudden change in diet, shifting late in life to the rich fare of the Norse elite. She had not been born into that world, she had been taken into it. Perhaps she was a noblewoman, captured in a raid, dragged across rivers and seas until she found herself bound to a household of immense power. In life, she served. In death, she was sacrificed. The Oseberg burial dazzled with beauty. Sledges adorned with carvings, woven tapestries, animals slain to accompany their mistress, but within that magnificence lay the silence of possession. The younger woman's presence was not honour, but proof of ownership. She did not lie in that chamber for her own glory, but to underscore the grandeur of the elder, the true figure of power. Her life had ended not by age or illness, but by ritual, her death demanded as part of another's passage to the afterlife. For the noble women taken in conquest, this was the ultimate fate, to be treated not only as thralls in life, but as offerings in death. The sagas speak rarely of such sacrifices, but archaeology whispers the truth. Bones of foreigners lie in Viking graves, their lives extinguished to accompany lords and ladies into the next world. It was the final stripping of agency, a reminder that captivity knew no limit, not even the grave. To the Norse, such acts were not cruelty but order. Death rituals required attendants, companions, servants to ease the journey. To the younger woman of Oseberg, it was erasure. Whatever family had once called her daughter, whatever kingdom had once expected her to wed into power, all were lost beneath the soil of Vestfold. Her legacy was consumed by another's, her voice silenced in the grandeur of the ship. The Oseberg ship sails now only in memory, reconstructed in museums and stories, but within its timbers lingers the truth. The noble woman buried there was not honoured but claimed, bound even in death to the authority of her mistress. Her sacrifice is a reminder that conquest did not end with chains or markets. It reached into the earth itself, binding women to their captor's glory, ensuring that even the afterlife bore the mark of possession. When the first snows fell across the north, life in the longhouse closed in. Smoke from the central hearth thickened in the rafters, weaving through the carved beams until the air itself felt heavy. For the noble women taken in conquest, winter was not a season of feasts and song, but a slow crucible of servitude. Their crowns and silks were gone, replaced with coarse wool garments, their hands raw from labour. They wove cloth on upright looms, spun thread until their fingers bled, ground grain into flour from dawn until dark. The work never ceased, and the silence of winter pressed upon them like a second weight of chains. In their former halls, servants had bent to their commands. rushing to light fires or prepare meals at a word. Now, stripped of title, they performed those same tasks for the warriors who had dragged them across the sea. The humiliation was sharper than the cold, each motion a reminder of lost power. Even the simplest acts carried memory. Stirring stew reminded them of feasts once held in their honour. Weaving cloth recalled garments embroidered with their family's crest. Each task was a shadow of a life that had been burned away. The longhouse itself was both prison and stage. Noble women laboured alongside thralls, their status indistinguishable. The wives of jarls looked on with suspicion, guarding their place at the hearth. Every glance was a warning, every order a reminder that the captive's presence was tolerated only so long as she proved useful. A misstep could bring punishment, a blow, a night spent in the freezing dark outside the hall. Survival meant obedience, yet even in obedience, dignity withered. Winter nights stretched endlessly, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the murmur of sagas told by men. The captives sat on the edges of the gathering, their faces dim in the shadows. Their voices were absent from the songs, their names unspoken in the tales. Yet in whispers, when the hall grew quiet, they spoke to one another. They traded fragments of memory prayers, verses, the sound of bells from distant abbeys, the smell of their homelands in spring. These whispers were fragile embers, small flames of remembrance in the surrounding dark. Children were born in such winters, the offspring of forced unions. For the captives, each child was both burden and hope. A daughter might grow to share her mother's silence. A son might rise within the household as fosterling, claimed by the captor's kin. Bloodlines interwove, reshaping the future of the North. Yet for the women, their own identity dissolved further with every birth. Their bodies had become part of the machinery of conquest, producing heirs for dynasties not their own. Thus the winter of servitude ground on, season after season. Outside, the snow lay heavy on the fields, the fjord frozen in silence. Inside, the noble women bent over looms, stirred pots, and endured. Their labour sustained the households that had stolen them, their memories the only inheritance left unbroken. In their silence and toil, the hidden cost of conquest endured, etched into every thread and every scar. When night fell in the longhouse, and the fire sank low to glowing embers, another duty was demanded of the captive women. By day they wove and cooked, bent beneath the weight of labour. By night they were forced into the bed of obligation. For noble women taken in conquest, this was the most bitter of humiliations. In their homelands, marriage had been a sacred contract, blessed by church or sworn before kin, their choice at least considered. In the north, their voices carried no weight. Under Norse law, once taken, they were property, and the will of their captor became their fate. The sagas speak little of this directly, for they were written by men, but their silences speak volumes. Words like frilla, concubine, appear often, the term used casually, as though it carried no wound. Yet behind that single word lay nights of coercion, of women lying awake staring into the smoke-dark rafters, their dignity stripped away. Some endured quietly, retreating inward, their bodies present but their spirits elsewhere. Others resisted and suffered the lash or the iron grip of those who claimed ownership of them. For every woman carried across the sea, the bed was not a place of union but of command. Children were born of these nights, their lives tangled in contradictions. Sons of noble mothers and Viking fathers grew to be jarls and chieftains, their mixed bloodlines strengthening dynasties. Some rose to greatness, like Olaf the Peacock, whose mother had once been a mute concubine. Yet while their sons might carry names into sagas, the women themselves remained nameless, remembered only as the vessels through which new lineages were forged. Their daughters, too, often vanished into silence, absorbed into households, married off without record. The bed of obligation produced heirs for captors, but erased the legacy of the women themselves. The longhouse bore witness to it all. The carved beams that glowed red in the firelight heard the muffled cries of women torn from their homeland, and the laughter of men who boasted of conquests measured not only in land and silver, but in flesh. Even wives, seated in authority beside their husbands, knew the unspoken truth. Concubines and captives shared their hearth, and rivalry simmered beneath the smoke. Some wives grew bitter, lashing out at the women, forced into their homes, turning resentment into cruelty. For the captives, there was no escape from suspicion by day and violation by night. And yet, in this darkness, fragments of resilience flickered. Some women taught their children their native tongues in secret, weaving songs of their past into lullabies whispered against the crackle of the hearth. Others maintained silence as a form of defiance, never gifting their true names to the men who claimed them. The bed could strip them of freedom, but not always of memory. Thus the bed of obligation became another battlefield, quieter than the raid, hidden behind timber walls, but no less brutal. It was here that conquest reached its most intimate depth, not with sword or flame, but with the crushing weight of power imposed upon a captive body. In every noble woman forced into that bed, another kingdom fell not on the battlefield, but in the silence of the night. In Viking society, law was spoken aloud beneath the open sky. The Thing, the great assembly, gathered chieftains, free men, and judges to decide disputes and shape the rules of their world. It was here that oaths were sworn, insults avenged, and inheritances decided. Yet for the noble women taken in conquest, the Thing was no refuge. Under its rulings, once they were bound in chains, their status changed forever. The voice that once held weight in their homelands was silenced with a single word: thrall. To the Norse, a thrall was property, not person. Law codes, preserved in the Gragas and other fragments, speak with chilling clarity. A thrall could be bought, sold, inherited, or even sacrificed at a master's command. No oath sworn by a thrall had binding power, no testimony was valid, no inheritance could pass through their line. For noble women who once advised kings or commanded abbeys, the stripping of rights was as devastating as the loss of freedom itself. In the eyes of the Thing, they no longer existed as individuals. Sometimes families sought to ransom these women, pleading through envoys for their return. The Thing would hear such bargains, weighing silver against desire. A princess might be redeemed if her kin could pay enough to outweigh the profit she represented as a concubine or wife. But many were never ransomed, their families too weakened or too impoverished to gather the staggering sums demanded. In such cases, the law offered no hope. The ruling stood: she was thrall, her fate sealed by conquest. The Thing could also formalize forced unions. A noblewoman taken captive could be declared a man's wife if the assembly recognized the claim. Consent was not considered, possession was enough. Once the Thing confirmed it, her status shifted not to freedom but to obligation. She might rise from thrall to wife in name, yet her marriage remained an instrument of conquest. Her children would belong to the lineage of her captor, her own heritage buried beneath the law's weight. For the women themselves, the Thing was a cruel theatre. They were sometimes made to stand before the gathering, displayed like trophies, while their fates were debated over horns of ale. Their voices, if raised, carried no weight. Their words were drowned out by the judgments of men. Even silence could be twisted into compliance, for law in the Viking Age was not about justice for the powerless, it was about order, wealth, and control. And yet, within these assemblies, fragments of resistance endured. A few sagas whisper of women who spoke boldly despite the law, cursing their captors before the crowd, reminding all who listened of their true lineage. Though the Thing dismissed their claims, their words lingered, remembered by those who carried tales into later generations. Thus the Thing, a pillar of Viking society, became another stage of captivity. Beneath its open sky, noble women saw their identities erased with formality, their lives reduced to property by decree. the law that bound warriors in honour unbound women from personhood. In its judgments, the true power of conquest was made permanent, echoing not in battlefields, but in words spoken before the crowd. In the courts of kings and jarls, marriages had always been tools of alliance. A daughter carried with her not only beauty or skill, but the promise of land, warriors, and peace between rival houses. Yet when conquest overturned thrones, the noble women who once brought dowries into unions now became the dowry themselves. After Viking raids, when treaties were negotiated and peace demanded, it was often the captive princess or abbess who sealed the bargain. Her body was the coin, her future the ransom. Chronicles from England and Ireland speak in hushed tones of such arrangements. A noblewoman spared execution might be handed over to a rival as a bride, her unwilling vow binding the survivors of her kingdom to silence. In these cases, the marriage was not celebration, but capitulation. Her presence in the new hall was proof of defeat, a living reminder to her kin that resistance had failed. To the Vikings, these unions offered legitimacy. Through her blood, they claimed a right to lands that might otherwise remain hostile. To the women, it was exile in the guise of marriage. The dowry of defeat often came without silver or land. Instead, it was measured in humiliation. A princess who once expected to wed in a church before kin and court might instead be given away in a smoky longhouse, her vows spoken in a tongue she barely understood, surrounded not by family, but by those who had slaughtered them. The feast that followed was not her triumph, but her captors, her presence at the high seat, a token of conquest. Every glance reminded her of what had been lost. For the families left behind, the arrangement was agony. To agree to such a marriage was to admit weakness, to hand over a daughter as the price of peace, yet many had no choice. To refuse meant further raids, more blood, perhaps the annihilation of their entire house. In paying the dowry of defeat, they bought survival for their people at the expense of one life. In this way, noble women bore the weight of kingdoms, their fates intertwined with the survival of thousands. Some who endured these forced unions found ways to carve influence within their new halls. Through skill in weaving, healing, or counsel, they gained respect, and in rare cases their children rose to prominence, blending foreign blood into Norse dynasties. But even when they shaped the future, their pasts were left behind. Their names in chronicles became thin, often replaced by the titles of wife or mother, their individuality erased. The dowry of defeat was not silver, not cattle, not coin. It was flesh and lineage, traded in silence across smoky halls and written in the blood of forgotten treaties. Every noblewoman given as peace offering carried with her the memory of fallen banners and burned halls. And though sagas rarely name them, their sacrifice bound kingdoms together more tightly than any chain of iron. For them, marriage was not choice, but surrender given form, the last echo of conquest whispered at a wedding feast. Behind monastery walls, noble daughters often sought safety. Cloisters were thought to be sanctuaries, fortified not with swords, but with prayer, with stone walls, and the constant rhythm of psalms. Parents gave their daughters to the church, not only for devotion but also for protection, believing that consecrated ground was shielded from the world's violence. Yet Viking sails cut through that illusion as easily as they cut across the sea. The raiders who descended upon abbeys and nunneries saw them not as holy places, but as vaults of silver and halls filled with women of noble blood. The chronicles recount raid after raid upon monasteries in Ireland, England, and Francia. At Lindisfarne, the shock of attack was so great it was remembered for centuries, yet few lines were given to the women carried off. In Coldingham, the abbess Ebba chose mutilation rather than violation, and her sisters followed, ending in fire. In countless other cloisters, no such defiance was recorded. Instead, doors splintered, bells fell silent, and abbesses and nuns alike were bound in chains. Many of these women came from noble families, placed in cloisters as guardians of piety and lineage. Their capture was more than personal tragedy. It was an attack upon the prestige of entire dynasties. For the captives themselves, the fall of the cloister was the unravelling of a sacred vow. Veils torn away, habits stripped, they were thrust into a world that cared nothing for their oaths. To Vikings, a consecrated woman was no different from any other captive. Her prayers did not raise her value, except perhaps in the curiosity of buyers who wondered if her education in Latin or healing might bring higher price. An abbess, once ruler over land and tenants, could find herself weaving or grinding flour in a foreign hall, her titles erased with a single raid. The loss of cloistered women reverberated through Christendom. Letters of lament were written by bishops, condemning heathens who carried away God's brides. Yet, these laments rarely spoke of the women themselves, only of the insult to the church. The noble-born abbesses, once chroniclers and leaders in their own right, became invisible, reduced to symbols of violation rather than remembered as individuals. Their names, preserved in charters and abbey rolls, often vanish at the very year their cloisters were raided. Silence replaced their voices. And yet, in whispers, traces endure. Stories passed down in hidden manuscripts tell of women who taught prayers in secret to their children in Norse households, weaving strands of Christianity into lands still ruled by Odin and Thor. Others became remembered in local legends, saints in exile whose relics were never found. Their vows had been broken by force, but the memory of their devotion lingered. The cloister, thought to be sanctuary, proved instead to be a gate. Through it, noble women passed from the quiet of the chapel into the roar of longships, their fates rewritten by fire and steel. Their capture was conquest, not only of kingdoms, but of the very idea of refuge, proving that in the Viking Age, no walls, however holy, could shield a noble woman from the grasp of war. For the noble women, carried far from their homelands, the hearth became the place of their quietest humiliation. Once they had overseen households, giving commands to servants, and arranging feasts in halls where their family banners hung. Now they bent low before fires that were not their own, stirring stews for strangers, weaving cloth whose patterns bore none of their ancestral symbols. The longhouse, thick with smoke and chatter in an unfamiliar tongue, reminded them with every glance that they no longer belonged. The hearth was the centre of Norse life, where men told sagas and skalds recited verses of victory. For the captives, it became both prison and stage. They served meals to men who had killed their kin, passed horns of mead to wives who eyed them with suspicion, and sang lullabies to children who would never know their mother's true heritage. The hearth, which once symbolized warmth and continuity, became instead the crucible of loss, where memory was forced to contend with survival. Some women adapted, learning the Norse tongue quickly to earn a fragile place in the household. Their skill in weaving, healing, or storytelling became tools for survival, small ways to carve a niche amid strangers. Yet, even in adaptation, they bore the constant weight of their former selves. Princesses who had judged disputes, abbesses who had guided cloisters, daughters who had been promised to kings. Each night, as the fire dimmed and shadows lengthened, memory returned, cutting sharper than any chain. Others clung to their native languages in whispers. In the hush after feasts, they hummed songs in Gaelic or Latin, their voices quiet enough to escape notice, but steady enough to teach a child or fellow captive. These fragments of culture, smuggled into foreign hearths, were acts of resistance as much as of remembrance. Through them, something of their old world survived, even when their names and status did not. But the hearth was also a place of constant risk. A misplaced word, a bitter glance, or a refusal to serve could ignite fury. Wives of Jarls sometimes struck at captives, jealous of their presence. Warriors, drunk from feasting, might seize upon them as reminders of conquest. For the women, Every movement was a careful balance between invisibility and usefulness. Too quiet, and they risked being deemed expendable. Too visible, and they risked wrath. In this cycle, days bled into nights, and years passed with little change. The hearth, that should have symbolized belonging instead, hardened into a reminder of exile. Each act of service reinforced their place as outsiders, their dignity traded for the chance of survival, and yet, in the smoke and shadows, the noble women endured. They carried their memories within, tending them like hidden embers, hoping that in some way their lineage would not vanish completely. For though the hearths they served were foreign, the fire within them still belonged to another land. In the halls of the north, conquest was displayed not only in silver hoards or carved prows, but in the faces of the women seated at the feasts. Among them were noble captives, their beauty turned into a spectacle of triumph. Once adorned in the finery of their own courts, they were now dressed in garments chosen by their captors, paraded as symbols of power. A princess might sit beside a jarl, her silence interpreted as obedience, her presence proof that his reach extended across seas. To the warriors who feasted, she was not a woman but a banner of victory. Her posture at the high seat proclaimed his strength. Her jewels, reforged from her family's treasures, glinted in the firelight as testimony of his wealth. Her beauty, which in her homeland had promised alliances or dowries, was here reimagined as spoils. The sagas, when they mention such women at all, present them not as individuals but as extensions of a man's glory, their names eclipsed by his. For the women themselves, each feast was a torment. The mead horns passed into their hands carried not celebration but humiliation. Laughter around them recalled the clash of arms that had ended their world. Every glance reminded them they were ornaments in a hall of strangers. Some lowered their eyes, retreating into invisibility. Others held themselves with rigid pride, refusing to let defeat bend their bearing. Either way, their beauty was a weapon wielded against them, reshaped into a tool of dominance. Even wives and queens of Norse blood felt the unease. A captive noblewoman's presence at the hearth was a constant reminder of rivalry. Jealousy could ignite whispers, even violence, as households strained under the tension of beauty turned into conquest. The captive woman bore the brunt of this suspicion, her life balanced on the edge of usefulness and danger. To be too silent risked dismissal, to be too visible risked wrath. In either case, her existence was measured by the gaze of others. And yet, beneath the surface, fragments of resistance remained. Some women used their appearance to shape small victories, earning favour, protecting children, or buying time to whisper their heritage into the ears of sons. Others let silence speak louder than words, their beauty framed by unyielding refusal to smile, to soften, to forget. In these quiet gestures lay defiance, invisible to those who saw only a trophy, but powerful to those who understood the weight of endurance. Thus the mask of beauty, though admired by halls of warriors, hid beneath it stories of grief, resilience, and unbroken memory. For while the conquerors displayed these noble women as symbols, the women themselves knew the truth. Beauty could be taken, paraded, and used, but behind the mask, their spirit endured. In every gaze that measured them, they carried a reminder of the halls they had lost, and the crowns that had once been theirs. When noble women were carried off in chains, it was not only their freedom that was lost, but the very continuity of their families. In the old halls of their fathers, genealogies were carved into memory, each name spoken at feasts to bind the present to the past. A daughter's marriage was meant to extend that line, linking one house to another, ensuring that the blood of kings did not vanish, yet conquest severed those threads. A noblewoman taken from her people was erased not by death, but by silence. The chronicles themselves reveal this absence. Where the names of kings and jarls are written in long succession, where warriors are honoured for their valour, the women disappear. They are recorded as many taken, or a number of captives, their identities replaced by numbers, their heritage dropped from the record. Daughters of kings who once embodied the future of dynasties became invisible, their children absorbed into other households, their bloodlines broken in the eyes of their kin. The sagas sing of men's glory, but rarely of the women who carried those men into being. For the women, this erasure was a wound deeper than chains. They knew that in being taken, they carried with them the future of their people, yet they had no way to pass it on with honour. Sons born in foreign halls bore the names of their captors, not of the fathers and grandfathers who had ruled their mother's land. Daughters were married into stranger lineages, their foreign blood both a mark of status and a shadow of shame. In time, the memory of their origin faded, their names spoken only in whispers until even those whispers died. The Vikings understood this power. To seize noble women was not only to gain wealth in silver, but to weaken kingdoms. By cutting the thread of lineage, they denied their enemies the stability of dynasties. Each captured woman was another branch lopped from a family tree, leaving it withered, unable to spread. Conquest was not only waged with fire and sword, but with silence, the silence of erased names, of broken genealogies, of heirs who never returned to claim their rightful place. Yet within this breaking, fragments endured. Some women whispered their true names to their children, planting memories like seeds in the dark. Others passed on secret prayers, verses of Latin, or half-forgotten songs from their homeland, so that even if their bloodline no longer ruled, its memory lingered. These fragments were fragile, often lost, but in rare cases they surfaced generations later when descendants sought to trace their origins. Still, the greater truth remains. Noble women's captivity was the unspoken ruin of dynasties. Crowns melted into coins, genealogies cut short, names falling away into silence. Conquest could kill kings on the battlefield, but it was through the erasure of women's lineage that kingdoms themselves were undone. In the broken lines of their blood, the true cost of defeat was measured silent, irretrievable, absolute. When the longships swept across Christendom, they did not only seize treasure and lives, they tore at the faith that bound noble houses together. Many of the women captured in raids were devout Christian princesses, raised in courts where Mass echoed daily. Abbesses who had sworn vows before relics, daughters of lords baptized in the name of the Trinity. To be dragged from cloisters and courts into pagan longhouses was more than a change of place. It was a shattering of identity. Their faith, once a shield, became a mark of vulnerability. Some were forced into baptism anew, stripped of their old identity in a perverse inversion of holy ritual. The water poured over them was not a sacrament, but a symbol of ownership, a declaration that they now belonged to the household of their captor. Their Christian names, given at birth, might be discarded for Norse ones, each syllable eroding ties to their past. A woman who had once been celebrated as the daughter of a Christian king could vanish beneath the new title of frilla, concubine, her sanctity erased in the eyes of both faiths. The Norse themselves did not always mock Christianity. Some saw in it a tool of power. A captive abbess might be valued not for her prayers, but for her knowledge of Latin and her ability to heal. Her cross, once a symbol of devotion, became part of her price. Yet others were made to abandon it altogether, their relics taken and melted, their hymns silenced beneath the chants of skalds. The veils of abbesses, torn away in the smoke of raids, became trophies, proof that even God's servants could be conquered. For the women, this rupture was devastating. Faith had offered them meaning, structure, and hope of salvation. Now, forced to bear children in pagan halls, they questioned whether their souls were stained by violence beyond their control. Some clung fiercely to their prayers, whispering paternosters beneath their breath as they stirred pots or wove wool. Others taught their children the sign of the cross in secret, passing fragments of their faith into foreign households. And some, under years of pressure, allowed the veil of Christianity to fall away, whether from survival or despair, leaving behind the God who had seemed silent in their hour of need. The chronicles mourn the fall of churches, the burning of relics, the martyrdom of bishops, yet they say little of the noble women who bore the weight of this religious fracture in their bodies and souls. Their silence is a wound in the record, one as deliberate as the erasure of their names. Thus the veil of Christianity, once thought a shield, became instead a fragile thread. Torn in conquest, it revealed not only the vulnerability of women, but the fragility of kingdoms that trusted faith to protect them. For the noble captives, their faith was not lost entirely. It lingered in whispers, in secret prayers, in lullabies to children who carried crosses hidden in their hearts. Yet for many, the veil was torn too wide to mend, leaving them suspended between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. Among the greatest sources of Viking wealth was not plunder alone, but ransom. Kings and lords knew the value of a life restored, and none carried greater price than noble women. To capture a princess, an abbess, or the wife of a great lord was to hold silver in living form. Their bodies became currency, their release negotiated in hushed councils where every coin weighed against pride and power. For the captives, ransom was both hope and torment, the promise of freedom dangling just beyond reach, measured by the wealth of their kin. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and Irish Annals tell of noble women taken and later returned only after vast sums were paid. Whole villages emptied their coffers, churches melted chalices, kings stripped their treasuries to buy back daughters and wives. At times, the price was so high it weakened a kingdom, leaving it vulnerable to the very men who had made the demand. A single woman could cost more than a year's tribute, her value in silver greater than that of cattle, fields, or ships combined. But ransom was never guaranteed. Families sometimes hesitated, torn between love and survival. Could a kingdom afford to risk famine or military weakness to redeem one life, even the life of a queen? Captors exploited this uncertainty, parading their hostages, sending messages that sharpened the wound of delay. For the women, each day in chains was a reminder that their worth was being haggled over in foreign halls. Freedom was not a certainty, but a gamble. The ordeal of ransom scarred the spirit as much as captivity itself. A woman who returned to her homeland found herself changed. She had endured humiliation, perhaps even motherhood in a foreign hall, her body no longer untouched, her faith shaken. Though celebrated as redeemed, she often bore whispers of suspicion. Was she still loyal? Had she been sullied? In some courts, a ransomed noblewoman became a living reminder of defeat, her presence recalling the silver drained from coffers and the shame of surrender. Not all were fortunate enough to be ransomed. Many lingered until families fell silent, either unwilling or unable to pay. These women vanished into Norse households, absorbed as wives or concubines, their origins remembered only by themselves. The sagas rarely tell their names, yet the practice of ransom itself speaks to their importance. Even when erased from records, their absence marked kingdoms like scars carved in wood. Thus, ransom was a chain of its own. It held women suspended between two worlds, one where they belonged and one where they were forced. The silver that measured their freedom became another weapon of conquest, draining the treasuries of kings and binding noble women in the cruel arithmetic of survival. In their lives, the Vikings discovered a wealth greater than gold, and in their captivity, kingdoms learned the bitter truth that a daughter or wife could be more costly than a lost crown. From the ashes of conquest came children, born not from choice but from power. Among them were those the sagas called bastards, children of noble women taken in raids, and Viking men who claimed them through the bed of obligation. These sons and daughters lived in the tension of two worlds, carrying the blood of kings or abbesses, yet marked by the stain of captivity. Their existence was a constant reminder of conquest, a living testament that lineage could be reshaped by force. For the mothers, each birth was both blessing and wound. To cradle an infant was to feel hope flicker, yet to know that child belonged not to her lineage, but to her captors. Sons bore Norse names, raised among warriors who praised strength above heritage. Daughters grew into women whose marriages would serve their captor's clan, not their mother's kin. The noble women who bore them often whispered lullabies in their own tongue, smuggling fragments of identity into the ears of children who would never see their ancestral halls. The sagas themselves reveal how such children could rise. Olaf the Peacock, famed in the Icelandic sagas, was born to Melkorka, an Irish princess who lived as a concubine in silence. Though her name was hidden for years, her blood shaped him, and through him her lineage found voice again. Yet Olaf's story was rare. More often, these children blended into Norse households, their mother's heritage fading into rumour, their origins mentioned only when insulted in feuds. To call a man the son of a thrall was to strike at his honour, no matter the nobility of his mother's forgotten past. For the noble women themselves, the shadow of bastards was heavy. In Christian courts, their return with children born of pagan fathers brought suspicion and shame. Some were rejected entirely, seen as tainted by their captivity. Others clung to their children as the last remnants of their stolen lives, even when the world scorned them. The burden was unbearable, to love the child yet to know he was both memory of loss and proof of survival. Among the Vikings, however, blood was not always dismissed. A strong son, no matter his mother's chains, could grow into a warrior or even a leader. These children blurred the lines of conquest, weaving foreign blood into Norse dynasties. Kingdoms shifted subtly as bastards became lords, their mothers' silent legacies echoing in their veins. In this way, even captivity reshaped the future, though the women themselves remained in shadow. The shadow of bastards was thus twofold, a mark of shame in the eyes of some, and a foundation of power in the eyes of others. They were living contradictions, proof of conquest, carriers of silenced lineages, bridges between kingdoms that had burned. And behind every one of them stood a noble woman, whose fate was written not in her own hand, but in the bodies of the children she bore in the long, unrelenting silence of captivity. Far to the south, where the fjords gave way to the Danavirke and the narrow neck of Jutland, Hedeby thrived as one of the largest trading ports in the Viking world. Here ships from east and west met, their sails crowding the harbour with colours of Russ, Franks, Saxons and Norse. Silver clinked constantly in the air, for Hedeby was not only a market of goods, it was a market of people. For noble women carried across the sea, this place was both stage and judgment. The marketplace stretched wide, filled with stalls of furs, amber and ironwork. Yet, among them, stood pens where human beings were displayed. Captives of all ranks, from farmers' daughters to noble queens, stood in rows, their wrists bound, their fates debated in loud voices. Buyers prodded them, inspecting teeth, hair, and health as though they were cattle. For a noblewoman, once veiled in silk and ringed with attendants, the humiliation was absolute. She stood exposed beneath foreign eyes, her worth now measured not by lineage, but by the weight of silver scales. Merchants prized noble women above all. Their upbringing meant they carried skills in reading, embroidery, or healing, talents that raised their value. More importantly, their heritage offered prestige. To own a princess or a high-born abbess was to command status, a living trophy of victory. Some were sold into the households of Norse jarls, others sent east with Russ traders along the rivers to Kiev or Constantinople. A few were bought by Christian envoys who sought to ransom them back, but most disappeared into the tide of commerce, their names lost in the murmurs of the crowd. Hedeby's records, written in terse Latin and Old Norse, rarely speak of individuals. Instead, they note the numbers, how many captives passed through in a given year, how much silver changed hands. Yet archaeology whispers what the chronicles omit: shackles unearthed in the town, foreign ornaments reworked into Norse styles, and the bones of women with foreign origins tell of lives uprooted. The city prospered on their suffering. Its wealth built not only on trade of goods, but on the human flesh that passed across its quays. For the women, the market was the moment of erasure. Once sold, they were cut entirely from their old lives. Their families might never know where they had gone. Their names vanished from chronicles, their lineage folded into another household. The cries of the market, the clink of coins, and the press of strangers marked the boundary between who they had been and what they had become. Even the sound of their native tongue grew faint, drowned beneath the babble of traders speaking Norse, Frankish, Slavic, and Arabic. Thus, Hedeby, glittering hub of wealth and power, was also a place of shadows. Its quays bore witness to the breaking of bloodlines. Its stalls rang with the price of captivity. Behind every silver coin traded, a story was extinguished. For noble women sold here, Hedeby was not a marketplace, but a graveyard of identities, where crowns turned into currency and lives into commodities. Inside the timbered walls of the Norse longhouse, conquest did not end with the clatter of chains or the cry of markets. For the noble women taken in raids and forced into households, another battlefield awaited the hall itself. Here sat the wives of jarls and chieftains, women of Norse blood who guarded their place at the hearth with fierce pride. The arrival of a foreign captive, especially one of noble bearing, stoked jealous fires that burned hotter than the flames of the central hearth. To a Norse wife, the captive woman was both rival and insult. She embodied her husband's conquest, proof that he could seize treasures abroad that rivaled or surpassed the women of his own clan. Her beauty, her lineage, her foreign grace became a silent challenge to the wife's authority. And so, the longhouse seethed with rivalries unspoken in the sagas, but etched into daily life. Captives were struck for perceived insolence, forced into the most grueling tasks, or deliberately humiliated before the household. A noblewoman who once commanded deference in her homeland now found herself the target of scorn from women whose places were secure in law but precarious in affection. The sagas preserve faint traces of this tension. Tales of wives demanding that concubines be cast out, of quarrels that ended in blood, of insults that sparked feuds between entire families, all hint at the storm that brewed when captive women entered the hall. Yet the chronicles are silent on the voices of the captives themselves. Their suffering was not the concern of the skalds, who sang only of men's glories. Still, the tension shaped their lives. For every glance from a wife carried the weight of danger. For the captives, survival meant walking a knife's edge. Too much pride invited blows. Too much submission invited contempt. Some found protection in the children they bore, gaining a measure of respect as mothers of heirs. Others gained favour by excelling in crafts, weaving cloth finer than any seen before, or singing songs that hushed restless halls. Yet these small victories only deepened resentment, for the wives saw in them a slow encroachment upon their authority. The hall itself bore witness to these struggles. At the high seat sat the husband, his concubine perhaps at his side, while his wife glared from across the fire. Servants scurried, warriors laughed, but beneath the noise was a silence of hostility. Each meal, each feast, each winter night became a quiet war, fought with glances, gestures, and whispered insults. For the noble women who had been dragged into these halls, it was captivity within captivity, chained not only by law, but by the ceaseless enmity of those who should have been sisters in suffering. Thus, the Hall of Jealous Wives became another prison. no less cruel than the market or the battlefield. In its smoke and shadows, noble women endured not only the power of their captors, but the hatred of their captors' wives. Their lives became a delicate balance between usefulness and rivalry, every moment watched, every act weighed. And in that constant tension, their dignity eroded, leaving only the fragile strength of endurance. The chronicles of the North were written with sharp economy. Battles were listed, kings recorded, tributes counted. But when it came to the noble women taken in conquest, the ink ran dry. Their names, once spoken in courts and carved into genealogies, vanished into silence. Many were taken, the annals would say, as though the lives of queens, abbesses, and daughters could be reduced to a number. It was this silence, the deliberate forgetting, that became the deepest wound of all. For a noble family, lineage was everything. Names preserved honour, ensured inheritance, bound the living to the dead, yet captivity erased those bonds. A woman taken from her homeland became nameless in the sagas of her enemies. Her children bore the names of their fathers, her own lineage hidden or ignored. Even when she whispered her identity to her offspring, those whispers often faded by the next generation, lost in the clamour of new households. A crown melted into coins could be replaced, but a name erased could never be restored. The noble women themselves clung to memory as if it were breath. Some carved small marks into wood or bone, secret signs of who they had once been. Others wove their heritage into songs, lullabies that carried words from distant homelands, hoping children would remember even if the world did not. A few dared to tell their stories aloud, but in halls where skalds sang of kings and warriors, their voices were drowned. Silence, once chosen by some as defiance, became the condition imposed upon them all. The church mourned their loss in its own way. Letters written by monks and bishops lamented the capture of abbesses and nuns, yet rarely preserved their names. To the chroniclers, they were symbols of violated sanctity rather than individuals of flesh and will. In this erasure, the women were doubly bound, first in chains of iron, then in chains of silence that denied them remembrance. Yet fragments endure. Archaeologists uncover beads of foreign glass in Norse graves, the remains of women whose origins lay far from the fjords. Genetic traces whisper of Irish queens and Saxon abbesses absorbed into Norse bloodlines. Place names hint at forgotten captives, small echoes that resisted complete erasure. These traces remind us that though their names were silenced, their presence shaped the very fabric of the Viking world. The silence of forgotten names is the cruelest legacy of conquest. To die is to end, but to be erased is to vanish as though one never lived. For the noble women carried away after Viking raids, their suffering did not echo in sagas, nor were their triumphs preserved in verse. They became invisible threads woven into the tapestry of the North, their lives essential but unacknowledged. And so the silence endures louder than cries, more permanent than chains, marking the true cost of a conquest that not only bound bodies, but erased identities from memory itself. Among the cruelest ironies of conquest was that noble women, once destined to secure dynasties through carefully arranged marriages, now bore heirs for the very men who had destroyed their kingdoms. Their wombs became instruments of continuity, but not for their own lineages. Instead, their bodies ensured the survival of foreign households, binding them eternally to the blood of their captors. In their homelands, a noble woman's child would have been a link in an unbroken chain of ancestry, his name inscribed in genealogies, his future guarded by kin. But in Viking halls, the children born of captivity carried new names, Norse names, tied to the authority of the father. The mother's identity faded to a whisper. In many sagas, such children appear only in passing, their mothers unnamed, their noble origins erased, as though they had never existed. These were heirs, yes, but heirs who testified to conquest, not inheritance. For the women, motherhood was a double-edged fate. A child offered a fragile shield, for a mother could claim some protection through her role. Even a concubine gained a measure of permanence once she bore a son. Yet that same child reminded her daily of her chains. His smile carried both pride and sorrow. Pride that he lived, sorrow that he was marked by the blood of those who had stolen her freedom. She might teach him fragments of her own tongue, sing him songs of her homeland. But she knew he would grow beneath Norse law, a warrior of her captor's people. Some of these children rose to power. The sagas tell of men whose mothers had been foreign, even noble captives, who nonetheless became lords and chieftains. Their heritage was a source of tension, sometimes thrown at them in insult during feuds, sometimes celebrated when it brought prestige. But for the mothers, the triumph of their sons was bittersweet. Their bloodline endured, but it was entangled with the very power that had destroyed their homes. For daughters, the burden was heavier still. They inherited neither freedom nor remembrance. Married off into Norse households, they carried their mother's silence forward, their lineage buried beneath new unions. To be born of a captive was to inherit exile, to live without knowledge of the family banners and halls that had once defined half their blood. Thus the burden of heirs became another layer of captivity. Noble women gave life, yet in doing so they cemented the victory of their captors. Their children, loved fiercely yet marked by conquest, embodied the paradox of survival. Each birth was both a continuation and an erasure, continuation of blood, erasure of heritage. And so, in smoky longhouses where sagas were sung and oaths sworn, the children of noble captives grew. They listened to tales of their father's glory, never knowing the full story of their mother's sorrow. In their bloodlines, kingdoms had been broken and remade. In their lives, the legacy of conquest took root, ensuring that the burden of heirs would shape generations long after the chains had rusted away. In the centuries, when the hammer of Thor still clashed with the cross of Christ, captive noble women found themselves standing at the edge of two worlds. Many had been raised in Christian courts, their lives bound to the rituals of Mass and prayer, their faith the last inheritance of their houses. When taken by Vikings, they were thrust into halls where sacrifices were made to Odin, where the blood of animals spattered the stones, and where the smoke of pagan offerings rose to the rafters. Between these two faiths, they carried the heaviest burden, to abandon their god or risk the wrath of their captors. Some were forced into conversion. Their captors, eager to display power, demanded that they renounce the cross and join in the rites of the North. At feasts, they were compelled to raise horns of mead in honor of the gods, to stand before idols and bow. To resist was dangerous. A woman who clung too openly to her faith risked beatings, starvation, even death. Yet many resisted in silence, whispering prayers at night, crossing themselves beneath their cloaks, or teaching their children hymns in secret. Their faith became not a banner, but a hidden ember, smouldering quietly in the dark. Others embraced conversion, whether by necessity or resignation. They wore Thor's hammer at their throats, joined in the rituals of blot, and outwardly became part of the community that had enslaved them. But for many, this was not belief but survival. To outwardly convert was to shield oneself, to claim a place in the hall that might mean less suspicion, fewer blows, or greater security for one's children. Behind the facade, some still clung to their god in silence, carrying two identities at once, one for the hall and one for the heart. There were women whose faith truly shifted, drawn into the rhythms of the North. The sagas tell of foreign wives who became priestesses, whose voices guided sacrifices, and whose hands poured offerings into the earth. Whether from conviction or necessity, they wove themselves into the fabric of Norse belief. In their acceptance, they erased part of their old selves, but they also claimed new power, finding influence in rituals denied them in Christian courts. Even so, their original lineage was gone, buried beneath new rites, new names, and new gods. The weight of conversion was more than spiritual. it severed bonds to family and homeland. To renounce Christ was to sever one's past. To refuse meant alienation in the present. In either choice, the noble captive stood alone, caught between two faiths, neither of which could fully claim her anymore. She belonged to no world completely, her identity split like a shield struck down the middle. Thus, in longhouses lit by both fire and fear, the noble women bore the weight of conversion. Their gods had not saved them from chains, and their captors' gods demanded obedience. In their silence, and in their whispers, they carried faith as burden, as rebellion, as mask. The sagas do not sing of them, but in their choices lay the unspoken struggle between two worlds, a struggle carved into their very souls. The Longhouse was not only a place of survival, but a theatre of power. Here, noble women taken in conquest found themselves displayed as part of their captors' triumphs. Feasts rang with the clash of horns, the thud of drinking bowls, and the laughter of warriors boasting of raids. For the women seated at the edges of benches or forced to serve at the hearth, these gatherings were cruel reminders of their fall. Their captors turned their presence into spectacle tokens of conquest, paraded before all who gathered. At such feasts, the captive noblewoman was made to pour mead into the cups of the very men who had dragged her from her homeland. Each step she took down the long firelit hall was watched, each bow of her head met with smirks. To the jarls and warriors, her service was not necessity but mockery, a visible sign that even queens could be reduced to servants. Sometimes her name was called aloud, her lineage recited as jest. A daughter of a king might be forced to ladle stew for a common raider, her noble birth invoked only to heighten the humiliation. The wives of the hall, seated in their high places, did not always shield her. They too joined in the spectacle, ensuring their rivals remained diminished. Insults could be whispered sharp, as daggers mocking her accent, her torn silks, the memory of her fallen kin. The feast, meant in older times to unite a household, became instead a stage where rivalries and humiliations were sharpened, all at the expense of the captive woman. For the noble captives, endurance was the only shield. Some carried themselves stiff with dignity, refusing to bow their heads, meeting the eyes of those who mocked them. Others withdrew into silence, their minds retreating to halls of memory, where feasts had once been in their honour. A few seized small moments of defiance, deliberately spilling mead, offering a stare that unsettled even the boldest raider. These acts rarely went unpunished, but they reminded all present that silence was not always surrender. The sagas hint at these scenes, though only in shadows. They describe concubines and thralls serving at tables, their presence unremarked yet ever present. The silence of their names is as loud as the boasts of men. Archaeology too whispers their presence. The bones of foreign women buried in Norse lands, the remnants of jewellery from distant courts, broken and reworked, once worn in halls that now mocked them. Thus, the feast became more than revelry. It was a ritual of domination, where wealth was measured not only in silver or cattle but in the bodies of the defeated. Each laugh, each song, each clatter of horn against table was another blow to the dignity of those seated or standing in chains. For the noble women, the feast was not celebration but humiliation, a reminder that their crowns had been melted into coin, their voices drowned beneath the roar of conquest. And in the smoke of those nights, their silence was louder than the laughter. When the first snows fell heavy across the fjords, the longhouse grew colder, darker, and hungrier. For the noble women taken in conquest, winter was a season of relentless trial. In their homelands, they had once presided over stocked pantries and well-prepared stores, ensuring their households were provisioned through the dark months. Now they bent under the commands of strangers, their survival tied to the rhythm of labour and scarcity. Hunger gnawed at them as surely as chains, a constant reminder that even the seasons had turned against them. In the smoky gloom of the longhouse, food was rationed with precision. Warriors ate first, their strength essential for defence and raids yet to come. Children of freeborn women were fed next, their futures bound to the clan. The captives' noble women included ate last. A once proud abbess or princess might find herself given only scraps of fish, a crust of barley bread hard as stone, or broth thin enough to see the bottom of the bowl. Starvation was not only a punishment, but a method of control, teaching obedience through weakness. The winter chores were endless. Noble women rose before dawn to grind grain on heavy quernstones, their shoulders aching from the constant rhythm. They carried water from frozen streams, their hands red and cracked from ice. They wove wool by dim firelight, the smoke stinging their eyes until they watered. All day and night, the sound of labour filled the longhouse, blending with the coughs of children and the low moans of the sick. For those who faltered, there was no mercy. A woman who collapsed from exhaustion was beaten or cast outside to freeze. Hunger, cold, and cruelty worked together to grind spirit as much as body. The chronicles do not speak of this daily torment. They count the silver of tribute, the number of ships in fleets, the victories of kings. But the true cost of winter was borne silently by the women whose names were erased. Some died in obscurity, their bodies dragged to shallow graves in frozen earth. Others endured, their strength the only reason their captors' household survived. A noblewoman's weaving might clothe a warrior, her grinding feed a family, her endurance keep a hall alive through storms. Yet her service was unacknowledged, her dignity stripped as thoroughly as her title. Still, even in hunger, fragments of defiance survived. Women shared scraps among one another in secret, whispered prayers over meals, or sang quiet songs of their homelands while their hands laboured. These acts, small as embers in the dark, preserved identity in the face of obliteration. The winters were long, but memory endured longer. Thus the winter of hunger became another battlefield of conquest. No swords were drawn, yet lives were taken. No banners waved, yet kingdoms withered in silence. For the noble women who endured those seasons, every breath was an act of survival, every heartbeat a refusal to let conquest erase them entirely. In their hunger lay the harshest truth. Survival was not granted, it was wrestled, one mouthful at a time, from the merciless grasp of winter. Long after the raids ended and the fires of conquest cooled, the scars remained not only upon the flesh of captive noble women, but within their spirits. To live as thrall in a Norse household was to endure 1,000 small cuts of humiliation, each one etching itself into memory. These women had once walked in silks and linen, their steps followed by servants. Now, their backs bent beneath endless toil, their hands roughened by labour, their bodies marked by punishments meant to remind them of their place. Whips were not uncommon. A noblewoman who faltered at her tasks might be struck across the shoulders, the sting of leather leaving welts that lingered for weeks. Some bore scars from irons heated in the hearth, brands pressed into their skin as living proof of ownership. These marks carried with them a cruel permanence, for even if ransomed or freed, the scars declared their captivity to all who looked. To the Vikings, such scars were symbols of dominion. To the women, they were disfigurements that whispered daily of lost crowns and burned halls. Yet the deeper scars lay hidden. Servitude eroded dignity. A woman who once dispensed justice in her father's court now fetched water for warriors who mocked her accent. An abbess who once ruled an abbey with wisdom now scrubbed floors beside common thralls, her vows mocked by the idols of another faith. The relentless monotony of service grinding, weaving, carrying stripped identity layer by layer. Many withdrew into silence, their spirits folding inward to shield themselves from despair. But not all. Some bore their scars as emblems of defiance. When Melkorka, the Irish princess, was sold into concubinage in Iceland, she refused to speak for years, her silence sharper than any curse. Her captors thought her broken, but her muteness preserved the last shred of her dignity. When at last she revealed her true heritage to her son, It was as though her silence had become a weapon, guarding her story until it could pass safely to another generation. Her scars, though unseen, became a testament to endurance. For many others, their scars lived on only in their children. Sons and daughters bore witness to the strength of mothers who endured chains, beatings, and endless toil. Though sagas rarely named these women, their blood flowed in the veins of kings and jarls, their endurance the silent foundation of dynasties. The scars they bore were not erased by time, but transmuted into resilience, carried forward in the lives of their descendants. Thus the scars of servitude were more than wounds of flesh. They were the marks of a system that reduced noble women to property, the branding of conquest upon living bodies. Yet within those scars lay stories of survival, hidden beneath silence, whispered in lullabies, etched in memory. The sagas may not sing of them, but every scar tells its own tale, that even in captivity, even in erasure, the noble women endured. And their endurance left marks far deeper than those cut into their skin. In the Viking world, silence was a double-edged blade. It could be punishment, enforced upon thralls who dared to speak out of turn, but it could also be weapon, wielded by noble women who refused to give their captors satisfaction. For those carried away in chains, silence became both survival and rebellion. Words could betray lineage, spark jealousy, or bring punishment. Silence, though isolating, became a shield that guarded the last fragments of self. The sagas offer glimpses of this defiance. Melkorka, the Irish princess sold into slavery in Iceland, is remembered not for her speech, but for her refusal to utter a word. Years passed before she revealed her heritage to her son, and even then it was spoken in private, as if the air itself might betray her. To her captors, her muteness made her invisible. To herself, it preserved dignity. She would not be their entertainment, nor their song, nor their tale. Her silence was her final power. Yet silence carried its own wounds. In longhouses, filled with laughter and the thunder of feasts, captives sat at the edges of benches, their mouths closed, their presence diminished. They listened to sagas sung of men who slew kings, of jarls who conquered, of gods who shaped the world. Their own stories, their own names, were never spoken. Each unuttered word was a fragment of self eroded, until the silence no longer felt chosen but imposed. To live without one's voice was to live half erased. Mothers whispered only to their children, songs of homeland, prayers in forgotten tongues, scraps of lineage all passed in low tones when no one else listened. These fragile whispers were lifelines. Through them, memory endured. A boy might grow to manhood, bearing his mother's silence, but in his heart he carried words she had dared to whisper in the night. A girl might hum melodies that belonged to lands she had never seen, echoes of a mother who refused to let silence erase her completely. Still, not all silence was resistance. Some women lost themselves to it entirely. The shock of capture, the endless toil, the nightly humiliations, these broke spirit as thoroughly as chains broke flesh. They withdrew into quiet that was no longer defiance, but despair. Their voices, once strong in courts and cloisters, faded until they spoke no more. Their names were forgotten not because they were stolen, but because they themselves ceased to speak them. The weight of silence hung heavy in every longhouse. It was the unspoken presence that filled the spaces between laughter, the shadow behind the clamour of horns. For the noble women who endured it, silence became both curse and legacy. They could not carve sagas or dictate chronicles, but in their refusal, in their whispered prayers, and even in their despair, they left a mark. It was not a song sung in feasting halls, but an echo that lingered in bloodlines, and in memory a quiet defiance, heavy as iron, that endured long after the chains had rusted away. Among the spoils of conquest, crowns held a symbolic weight greater than silver. When Vikings stormed halls and abbeys, they seized not only gold and treasure, but also the regalia of kings and queens. For noble women, the crown was more than ornament. It was the visible seal of lineage, proof of authority and belonging. To lose it was to lose the past itself. In the markets and longhouses of the north, many such crowns were melted down, their jewels pried out, their gold hammered into coin. What had once rested on the brows of queens now jingled in the pouches of warriors. For the women dragged away, this loss was deeply personal. Some had worn these crowns on feast days or seen them set upon their fathers' heads. Now they watched as their family's glory was reduced to raw metal, its sacred aura stripped by foreign hands. One chronicle tells of a captured queen forced to sit at the high seat without her crown, her bare head a spectacle of humiliation. Her captor drank from a goblet fashioned from her family's regalia, mocking her lineage with every sip. The crown, once the emblem of her people, became proof of her defeat. The sagas are silent on the women themselves, but linger on the treasure. They boast of arm rings forged from melted crowns, of ships purchased with gold once carried in royal coffers. For the Viking warrior, treasure was the true measure of conquest, not the dignity of those who lost it. Yet, archaeology reveals the deeper truth. Fragments of crowns, reliquaries, and brooches have been found scattered across Scandinavia, their origins traced to Ireland, England, and Francia. Each piece whispers of a hall that fell, a noble woman dispossessed, a lineage broken. The crown's destruction was not only symbolic, it had real consequence. Without regalia, a dynasty's legitimacy was harder to claim. A captive queen, stripped of her symbols, could no longer act as rallying point for her people. Her children, born in exile, carried no visible sign of their inheritance. In this way, the Vikings ensured not only immediate victory, but long-term erasure. By shattering crowns, they shattered futures. And yet, even without their regalia, noble women bore unseen crowns of memory. They remembered the weight of authority, the sound of courts where their names were spoken with respect, the gleam of banners in their fathers' halls. Though the metal was gone, the dignity remained within, unyielding despite humiliation. Some whispered their lineage to their children, telling them of crowns they would never see but which still marked their blood. Thus, the shattered crown became both wound and testament. Melted into coin, it fed the markets of Hedeby and Dublin, spread across the north as wealth. But in the hearts of the women who once claimed it, it remained unbroken, a symbol of what had been lost, yet never entirely destroyed. For memory cannot be melted, nor lineage erased by fire. The crown endured, invisible but indelible, in the silence of the women who carried its weight without wearing it. In every longhouse, the loom stood as tall as a man, its wooden frame pressed close to the smoke-dark walls. Here, the captives spent endless hours weaving. For noble women taken in conquest, the loom became both burden and refuge. Once, in their homelands, they had supervised others at this work, their fingers adorned with rings, while servants spun and wove at their command. Now their own hands bled from the threads, their backs ached from the weight of hours, and their dignity unravelled with every pattern they were forced to create. The Norse valued weaving above most crafts. A woman who could produce strong sails or fine cloth was considered indispensable. In markets, bolts of fabric could be traded as currency, as valuable as silver. Thus, the noble women were prized for their skill, their education, ensuring that their cloth was finer than most. The patterns they wove, though born of compulsion, carried with them fragments of memory. Knots and threads became secret scripts, motifs from homelands, shapes that recalled abbeys or halls long burned. Each pattern was a whisper, a way of keeping alive what conquest sought to erase. But the loom was also a prison. Day after day, the women laboured to clothe the very warriors who had enslaved them. The sails that billowed from the masts of Viking longships were often woven by captive hands, their threads tightening with each stroke until the cloth became wings of conquest. To weave was to feed the cycle of raids, to arm the same ships that would carry more daughters into bondage. Each pull of thread was a reminder of complicity forced by survival. The sagas rarely mention these labours, yet the silence speaks loudly. Cloth survives in fragments, pulled from graves, its patterns intricate, its quality high. Scholars trace foreign influences in the weave's threads that reveal women of other lands had bent their skill to Viking use. These fragments are silent testimonies, each thread spun by women whose names were lost, whose stories survive only in the fabric of a culture that consumed them. At the loom, the captives whispered. Their hands moved steadily, but their lips passed quiet words to one another, sharing scraps of memory or prayers in secret tongues. The loom's rhythmic creak drowned their voices, giving cover to their speech. In this way, the loom became more than tool. It became a place of defiance, where women built small sanctuaries in sound and pattern. While warriors feasted and children played, the loom bore witness to voices the sagas would not carry. Thus, the loom embodied the paradox of captivity. It was both the mark of servitude and the vessel of survival. Through it, noble women fed the very system that had bound them, yet also preserved pieces of their identity in threads and whispers. In the silence of the longhouse, the loom's creak was unending, as relentless as conquest itself. But within its rhythm, noble women left traces of themselves, woven into the very fabric of the Viking age. The hearth, which gave warmth and life in the longhouse, also became the place of judgment. For noble women taken into captivity, the fire was not always a refuge, it was often the instrument of punishment. A spilled horn of mead, a refusal to serve quickly enough, a whispered defiance. Any of these could bring retribution. The warriors who claimed ownership wielded the threat of fire as both warning and spectacle. Punishment was not only about discipline, it was about display, a reminder to all captives that obedience was survival. In some halls, branding irons were kept near the hearth, their ends plunged into flame until they glowed red. A woman who resisted too often might feel that searing kiss against her skin, the mark of possession burned into her flesh. These brands stripped her of identity, proclaiming her as property, a living thing reduced to commodity. Others were forced to kneel by the fire until their skin blistered from the heat, the pain intended to break spirit more than body. The longhouse walls absorbed these cries, their echoes lost beneath the laughter of those who feasted nearby. The sagas do not linger on such punishments. They are silent, focused on kings and battles, yet the laws of the Norse world reveal the truth. In the Gragas and Gulathing codes, the thrall had no voice, no protection. Their masters could punish at will, their lives valued in silver, but not in dignity. For noble women who had once presided over courts, to be reduced to this silence was torment greater than flame. The fire also served as spectacle. At feasts, when captives faltered in their duties, they were sometimes dragged before the hearth and struck or shamed. Warriors roared with laughter, wives sneered with satisfaction, and children watched with wide eyes. The punishment of a captive was not done in secret. It was woven into the life of the hall, ensuring that every spark of resistance was smothered in the presence of many. The noble woman became not only servant but example, her pain a lesson to others. Yet even within such cruelty, fragments of defiance remained. Some women endured their punishments in silence, denying their captors the pleasure of cries. Others carried their scars like grim trophies, reminders that though their flesh had been burned, their spirit was not extinguished. A few remembered faintly in chronicles, cursed their captors aloud, even as the fire seared them, their words hanging in the smoky air long after the punishment ended. The fire of punishment was a constant shadow in the longhouse, its flames both life-giving and threatening. It reminded all captives that survival was a fragile thread, easily snapped by the whim of another. For For noble women, the fire that had once symbolized feasts and family now marked humiliation and control. And yet, in its embers, they carried unyielding fragments of themselves, scars that bore witness to suffering, and silence that carried defiance no flame could consume. When noble women were torn from their halls and carried across the sea, they carried little with them but memory. Jewelry, silks, and crowns could be stripped away, but memory clung like breath, heavy and inescapable. For many, it was the only treasure they possessed, the sound of bells ringing from a cathedral, the scent of fields in spring, the faces of kin slain in raids. Yet, memory was a burden as much as a solace, a constant reminder of what had been lost and what could never return. In the silence of foreign halls, these women replayed their pasts endlessly. They remembered the banners of their fathers fluttering in the wind, the warmth of feasts held in their honour, the vows sworn by kin to protect them, each recollection cut like a blade. To see themselves now, serving at the hearths of their conquerors, was to measure daily the abyss between who they had been and what they had become. Memory, in its persistence, tormented as much as it comforted. Some tried to bury the past, forcing themselves into forgetfulness. They learned new tongues, adopted Norse customs, and silenced the songs of their childhood. For them, survival meant erasure. Yet even in forgetting, fragments lingered dreams of familiar faces, sudden pangs at the sight of a foreign banner, tears rising without reason during festivals. The past could never be fully smothered. It returned like smoke through cracks in the walls. Others clung fiercely to memory, using it as anchor. They whispered their stories to their children, weaving their heritage into lullabies and prayers. A son might grow up knowing that his mother was once a princess of Ireland, or a lady of Mercia, though he bore a Norse name. A daughter might learn the words of a foreign tongue, though she lived as thrall. In these whispers, memory resisted erasure. It became seed, small and fragile, but planted in the hearts of the next generation. The sagas, written by men, rarely record these acts, yet archaeology hints at their truth. Graves in Norse lands hold beads from the east, brooches from the British Isles, ornaments carried not as trade goods, but as relics of lives stolen. These objects, buried beside foreign women, speak of memory cherished even in death. They reveal that though the world sought to strip them bare, some fragments of the past endured, carried across oceans and across years. But memory was also a chain. Many women lived haunted, their minds never leaving the halls that had burned, the kin who had fallen. Each feast in a Norse hall echoed with remembered feasts in their own. Each lullaby sung reminded them of voices now silent. Memory kept them alive, yet it bound them to sorrow, ensuring that even in endurance they could never truly belong. Thus, the burden of memory became the last inheritance of the noble captives. It was treasure and torment, shield and chain. In silence and in whispers, they bore it across seas, through winters, into graves. And though their names faded, their memories lingered, an invisible weight shaping the destiny of the North. Not every captive noblewoman reached the markets of Dublin or the halls of Scandinavia. The sea, as merciless as the men who sailed it, claimed many before they could be sold. When longships set out heavy with plunder and human cargo, storms could rise suddenly, waves breaking over the decks, winds tearing the sails to shreds. In those moments, the captives chained in the belly of the ship were the most vulnerable. Bound hand and foot, with no hope of escape, they became offerings to the sea, whether they willed it or not. The chronicles mention shipwrecks in passing fleets, swallowed by the Irish Sea or the stormy waters off the Orkneys, but they do not dwell on the women who perished within them. Archaeology, however, has uncovered grim traces, shackles and chains dredged from coastal sands, fragments of cargo that hint at human lives lost with the rest. Each iron clasp tells the story of a captive who never saw the markets, a noblewoman whose lineage ended beneath the waves. For the Vikings, These losses were misfortunes measured in silver. A drowned princess was coin that slipped through the fingers of fate. But for the women themselves, the sea offered both terror and release. Some fought to free themselves from chains, clawing against the timbers as water surged in. Others prayed aloud, calling to saints as the ship lurched. And some, perhaps, embraced the sea as deliverance, choosing drowning over the life that awaited them in foreign halls. Sailors spoke of omens, of women's cries carried on the wind after storms, of pale faces glimpsed beneath the waves. To them, the drowned captives became restless spirits, haunting the roots of raiders, their voices mingling with the crash of surf against cliffs. These tales whispered of guilt unspoken, of the weight of lives treated as cargo and cast into the sea. Even the fiercest raider could not silence the ocean, and in its depths the truth of conquest lingered. For the kin left behind, the drowned women were doubly lost. Families who might have ransomed them never learned their fate. No messenger came, no ransom demanded, only silence. Their names were left unspoken in chronicles, their places in genealogies left blank. They became absences rather than memories, swallowed not only by the sea but by history itself. Yet the sea also preserved them in another way. Legends along coasts speak of maidens carried off by raiders and never seen again, of kingdoms weakened not only by conquest but by daughters lost to the waves. These stories, though vague, kept their memory alive in the minds of those who mourned. Thus, the drowned captives stand as silent witnesses to the perils of conquest. They remind us that victory was never certain, that the sea itself could claim what men had stolen. In their unseen graves beneath the waves, they carried crowns, prayers, and memories into the deep, leaving behind only echoes in the wind and the restless churn of the northern seas. Language was both shield and chain for the noble women carried into Viking captivity. Torn from courts where Latin prayers or Gaelic songs once filled the air, they found themselves thrust into halls where the harsh syllables of Old Norse dominated every word. At first, the sounds were foreign, a wall of meaning they could not scale. Commands barked at them were met with silence or confusion, earning punishment when obedience failed. To lose one's tongue was to lose one's place in the world, to be rendered mute in a hall filled with voices. For the captors, this silence was useful. A woman who could not speak their words was easier to dismiss, her protests drowned in laughter. Yet the Vikings were also practical. A noble woman who learned quickly could serve better, weaving her captor's speech into her survival. And so, some captives bent themselves to the strange language, trading their own for the Norse tongue. Slowly, syllable by syllable, they adapted, though each new word tasted bitter, for every phrase learned was a step further from the voices of home. Children born of these unions often grew bilingual, speaking Norse in the hall, but learning their mother's secret tongues in whispers by the hearth. Latin prayers, Gaelic lullabies, Saxon proverbs, these fragments were carried across generations, invisible threads woven into Norse households. The women, denied power in law, still shaped the language of their children, seeding memory where chronicles remained silent. In this way, their voices endured, though muffled, hidden beneath the louder cadences of skalds and warriors. But the loss of language cut deep. Many women, unable or unwilling to adapt, withdrew into silence. Their tongues stumbled, their words mocked, their dignity further eroded. To be laughed at for mispronunciation was to feel exile sharpened anew each day. Their voices, once honoured in courts and cloisters, became objects of scorn. Some chose to remain silent altogether, refusing to offer their captors the satisfaction of broken speech. Their muteness became both shield and prison, preserving dignity at the cost of isolation. The sagas preserve only faint traces of this struggle. When a man's insult included the phrase "son of a thrall," it often carried the hidden sting of foreign tongue and foreign mother. Behind that insult lay the memory of noble women whose voices had been silenced, their languages dismissed as worthless in halls that valued only Norse. Yet the persistence of foreign words in Icelandic and Old Norse dialects, loanwords from Gaelic, Saxon, and Slavic, reveals that those captive voices did not vanish entirely. They slipped into the very fabric of the conqueror's speech, enduring even when their names were forgotten. Thus, the broken tongue was not wholly lost. It fractured, reshaped, and seeped into new generations. For the noble women who bore this burden, every word spoken in a foreign tongue was a reminder of conquest. Yet every whispered lullaby, every prayer in Latin or Gaelic, was an act of resistance. Though their voices cracked and faltered, their tongues carried memory across the centuries, leaving traces in the very language of the North. Among the Norse, conquest was not only measured in silver or land, but also in ritual. To claim a noblewoman taken in war, her captor often staged an act of possession before the household, turning her into living testimony of his victory. These rituals were not elaborate ceremonies, but deliberate humiliations, simple, public gestures meant to strip her of identity and bind her to her new fate. Sometimes, the act was as crude as cutting her hair. A princess who once wore her braids adorned with gold rings might find them hacked away with a knife, her scalp left ragged and raw. In Christian courts, a veil had symbolized chastity or sanctity. In Norse halls, the removal of hair symbolized the end of her lineage's pride. She became, in an instant, no longer a daughter of kings, but a spoil of war. The hall roared with laughter, yet behind her silence lay a grief deeper than chains. Other times, the ritual was in the gifting of clothing. Stripped of the garments she had worn from her homeland, she was draped in rough wool, the attire of a thrall. In that moment, she was remade in the eyes of all who watched, her nobility erased, her body reclassified by fabric. Archaeological finds of torn silks reworked into Norse garments whisper of this transformation. Royal dresses cut apart, foreign embroidery restitched into shapes that bore no resemblance to their origin. The ritual was complete when she served her captors in her new attire, the hall acknowledging her as nothing more than servant. In some cases, she was forced to stand at feasts, horn of mead in hand, while her captor declared her his. Before wives, warriors, and thralls alike, she was claimed as property, her silence sealing the act. This was more than boast, it was binding in the logic of Norse law, where public declaration held weight equal to written word. In such displays, her captor turned her body into evidence of conquest, proof that his strength extended beyond battlefield into the very lives of his enemies. For the women, these rituals were as destructive as the raids themselves. To lose one's crown was loss of wealth. To lose one's name, one's garments, one's dignity, in the eyes of the hall, was loss of self. Yet within the humiliation, fragments of resistance survived. Some women endured the cutting of hair without tears, denying their captors the pleasure of seeing them break. Others refused to bow their heads, carrying themselves with the same bearing that had once been theirs in courts. These small gestures, invisible to skalds, kept alive sparks of identity that ritual sought to smother. The ritual of ownership, though unrecorded in sagas, is carved into silence and archaeology. It reveals conquest not only as violence, but as theatre acts designed to erase and to display, to strip women of their past and bind them to their captor's glory. Yet the very need for ritual betrays a truth. The conquerors knew what they had stolen was more than flesh. They had taken crowns, names, and lineages, and only through ritual could they hope to hold them fast. Whispers spread through the Viking world of captives who carried curses upon their tongues. Noble women, torn from kingdoms and cloisters, were feared not only for their lineage, but for the unseen powers they might bring with them. Some warriors swore that a queen's final words could doom a hall, that an abbess's prayer might turn feasts sour, that a daughter of kings might call ruin upon the men who bound her. In this way, fear mingled with scorn, shaping how captors treated the women they had stolen. The sagas hint at these fears in fragments. When a household suffered famine or plague, tongues whispered that it was the foreign woman at the hearth who had brought it. Her silence became suspect, her gaze unsettling. A glance too steady, a prayer too fervent, a muttered word in a foreign tongue, any of these could spark suspicion that she carried wrath from gods or saints. In such moments, captives bore not only chains, but the heavy weight of superstition, their very presence a reminder of unseen dangers. Punishment often followed. A noblewoman accused of curses might be beaten, cast out into the cold, or forced to endure rituals meant to break her power. Some were made to drink bitter brews of herbs, others forced to swear oaths before Thor's hammer to prove their loyalty. But the fear lingered, unshaken by any test. The idea that a captive could summon vengeance haunted even the fiercest warrior, for he knew that her suffering carried weight beyond silver. Yet these curses, whether real or imagined, became weapons in the captive's hands. Some women embraced the fear, speaking deliberately in foreign tongues, staring unblinking into the eyes of their masters, letting silence hang heavy after insults. They cultivated the image of danger, reminding their captors that to break them fully might invite unseen ruin. In halls where words carried the force of law and honour, even a whisper of sorcery could temper cruelty. Fear became fragile armour, giving the powerless a sliver of power. Stories spread of households undone by such women. A jarl who grew sickly after taking a captive bride, a chieftain whose sons quarrelled unto death after mocking their foreign mother. A hall burned mysteriously after a concubine spat her last curse before execution. Whether true or shaped by rumour, these tales endured, carried from hearth to hearth, reminding all that conquest had unseen costs. The curse of the captive was thus both legend and lived reality. For the noble women, it was not chosen but forced upon them, a mask imposed by the fears of their captors. Yet within it lay an unexpected form of survival. If they could not wield swords, they wielded suspicion. If they could not command armies, they commanded unease. And in a world where power was measured in fear as much as in silver, the whisper of a curse gave voice to women whom conquest had sought to silence. When age finally bent the backs of captive noble women, when their hair grew silver and their hands could no longer labour at the loom, their lives faded quietly into the shadows of foreign halls. Few were buried with honour, fewer still had their names spoken at feasts. Yet, in their final days, they carried within them the weight of all they had endured, the raids that had torn them from their homes, the markets where their worth was measured in silver, the longhouses where their silence had been demanded but never fully given. Their last words, if spoken, were laments, whispered to children or grandchildren, fragile echoes of kingdoms lost. These laments were rarely recorded in sagas or chronicles. The annals tell only of kings and battles, of silver hoards and shattered abbeys. But the truth lingers in fragments in lullabies preserved across generations, in prayers whispered in strange accents, in the faint traces of foreign blood woven into Norse lineages. Through these remnants, we hear the voices of women who refused to be erased, whose suffering shaped the very world that forgot them. Their laments were not shouts of defiance, but steady murmurs that endured across years, carried quietly from hearth to hearth, until they became indistinguishable from the culture that had absorbed them. Archaeology uncovers their silence. Graves in Scandinavia hold women buried with foreign ornaments, brooches of Irish and Saxon make, beads carried from distant lands. Some lie beside Norse men as wives, others alone in the earth, their origins betrayed only by the strangeness of their bones. These burials are the final stage of captivity, the point at which a woman, once noble, became indistinguishable in death from the people who had once enslaved her. The lament was not written in ink, but in soil, in the mingling of foreign artifacts with Norse earth. And yet, in rare moments, a lament broke through the silence. A son remembered his mother's homeland and travelled to see it. A daughter repeated prayers in Latin long after the cross had been hidden. A skald, moved by whispers, wove into a saga a fleeting mention of a woman whose beauty or silence marked her apart. These brief glimpses are all that survive of voices that once sang in courts and cloisters. Their laments may not have been loud, but they endured, seeded in memory. Thus ends the tale of noble women after Viking conquest, not with crowns restored, nor with triumph reclaimed, but with laments carried quietly into the ages. Their fate was merciless, their suffering unrecorded, their dignity stripped, yet their endurance reshaped kingdoms, their children carried their blood into dynasties, and their whispers left faint but lasting echoes. The last lament is not defeat. It is memory, stubborn and enduring, refusing to vanish even when every effort was made to erase it. And in that memory lies their final triumph, that though silenced, they were never entirely forgotten.